All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Board of Appeals. My name is Frank O'Brien, and I will be the acting chair for this hearing relative to the application for a comprehensive permit relative to the property located at 936 Brush Hill Road in Milton. Joining me this evening are my fellow board members, Jeffrey Mullen and Nicholas Gray. I see the applicant is here. I see in his team, I see peer reviewer, Mr. Bomer is here, Mr. Galvin's here as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this will be the agenda for this evening. I'm going to have a couple of opening remarks just to bring people up to speed as to where we are and what has been added to the website since our last meeting. Also have a few words about the site visit. Then what I'd like to do, Mr. Schomer, is give you a brief opportunity to kind of summarize the letter that was submitted on February 9th with some additional materials. Then I'd like to move to Mr. Bomer to provide an overview of the comments that he has submitted, give an opportunity for some back and forth on those comments from Mr. Galvin and other interested parties, and then we'll ascertain what our next steps need to be. So is that amenable to Mr. Gray and Mr. Mullen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So very briefly, since last we met, there have been a number of developments and a number of filings relative to this application. All of those filings are available on the town website relative to this particular application. I would just note that since our last meeting, we've had comments that were submitted by an interested citizen, Mr. Bob Wanamaker. We've had a submission by the applicant with some revised materials, which include a bike storage plan details, and earthwork plan details, and several other materials. Mr. Schomer will be walking us through those in a couple of minutes. We've also had an initial design peer review from the board's peer reviewer, Mr. Cliff Bomer. Welcome, Mr. Bomer, again to the board. And so, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about that. In addition, 2 Saturdays ago now, and I might add that we picked the wrong Saturday because it was freezing, and the following Saturday was like 60 degrees. So we picked the wrong Saturday, but we had a very well attended site walk. Thank you to the applicant and his team for joining us there. Thank you to the members of the board. Most of all, thank you to the interested citizens for joining us during the course of that site walk. Site walk lasted, I think, a little over an hour, maybe 90 minutes tops. I thought we had a good view of it. We had a number of questions that were raised. Some of those questions, some of those issues will be discussed during the course of tonight's hearing. Several others will obviously be discussed during the course of the rest of the hearing as well. But I thought we had a good visit, and it was useful, if not a little cold. So with that, let me pause and ask if any of the board members have any questions or comments they'd like to add relative to any of the filings or the site visit.
No
At this
questions.
time.
Hearing none. Mr. Schomer, I would invite you to provide us with a brief overview of, as I mentioned, your recently filed letter and some of the plans that accompanied it.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Chairman O'Brien, and good evening to you and to the members of the public. Attorney Galvin, hello.
Hi.
So on February 9th, as you mentioned, Mr. O'Brien, I submitted a letter that was outlining 8 issues that were, from our vantage point, the homework assignments that we were left with by the board members and by Mr. Reardon as well, who attended the first hearing on this. And we've attempted to address those. And the first four, that is, I'll leave to Tim Loranger of Embark, who has prepared a comprehensive presentation tonight to go into the details in further closer detail. And those specifically were the issue of on-site bicycle storage, as well as the details of the proposed parking structure in Building B at the rear of the site. The next issue was energy efficiency, proposed measures for that on the site. The next issue was the cut and fill and proposed grading arrangement of the site, as well as the relative height of the proposed buildings. And the last issue that I believe Tim will be going into is the issue of landscaping and the streetscape view of this project from Brush Hill Road, which, as we know, is a scenic road in Milton. And so obviously very important to the board members and to the members of the public and to us as well. So if I may, Mr. O'Brien, I'd like to defer discussion of that in detail for Tim Loranger in a moment, and just briefly go into the other three issues that were discussed in my letter. Okay, thank you. So the next three issues had to do first with the photometric study, which, as I believe we mentioned during the site walk, is still in progress. That is still being performed, and we're hoping to have that any day now. And as soon as it's done and ready for submission, we will be filing that. It's a plan that's prepared by an outside vendor that's associated with the lighting fixtures, and so it takes some amount of time for that to be prepared. And it's somewhat out of our control in terms of the timeline. So as soon as it's ready and provided to us, we will forward it on to the board for your review and for Mr. Bomer's review as well. I noted that he mentioned that in his comment letter that he would like to see a photometric plan, and we're happy to provide it. The next issue that was discussed briefly in my letter, Mr. O'Brien, was the issue that has been raised by some of the residents relating to the relationship of this project to Curry College. And I think we would be remiss not to note and be mindful of the presence, obviously, of Curry College in this neighborhood, which is a prominent feature of it, though it's not lost on us that it's far from the only feature of this neighborhood, which also features a number of single-family homes as well as multifamily developments in the area. So our clients have met with some representatives of Curry College recently, and they had a productive conversation. For all the folks at home who are listening, just to make it clear, this project is not affiliated in any way with Curry College. We're not an extension of Curry College. This will not be a Curry College dorm or faculty housing or fraternity or anything like that. It'll be next door to it. That's obvious, and it's been designed somewhat with Curry College and the presence of that in mind, but it's certainly not intended to be an extension or a creeping of Curry College. We're sensitive to that. Some of the neighbors mentioned that to us on the site walk. So the conversation that our clients had with Curry representatives were, as I mentioned, it was favorable. Their view is that this will likely not be a draw for student housing of Curry College, because they're promoting on-campus living for students, and that's something of great importance to them. What they expressed to us is that they expect that faculty members or staff may have interest in residing in some of these units, and particularly faculty, for example, who are visiting faculty or on sabbatical or that sort of thing, could be potential residents of this project. But obviously that's obviously speculative to a certain extent. But what they did say to us is that student residence of the project is not expected, and I think that's our takeaway from the site walk and from the previous hearing, was that that's of primary concern to the neighbors, that this not become a frat, not become a dorm, and that's certainly not our intention with this project. The final issue that was addressed in my letter, we have a bit of an update, Mr. Chair, which is the issue of site access and safety for the town's fire apparatus, and that was also mentioned by Mr. Bomer in his letter. I can report to the board that we met with Fire Chief Madden and Tim Zerwinski last Friday, February the 11th, and we had a brief but productive conversation about that. He did express to us that the site access was somewhat tight, particularly in instances where there might be multiple vehicles responding to events on the site. And so he wanted us to take a look at options for loosening up the site to give him more accessibility. He also mentioned taking into consideration more accessible central locations for the fire hydrant, as well as revising some of the building details on the roof to provide better and easier access in the event that that firefighters need to access the roof and descend down via the parapet roof. So all of those were taken into consideration. And at the request of Mr. Zawinski, we have held off for the moment at making any changes to the project or changes to the plans until we have all the peer review in hand. So at this point, we're taking those into consideration, and we'll take them into account as we move forward with project changes. So that, Mr. Chair, that summarizes my letter, the issues within my area of expertise. At this point, would you prefer to go to Mr. Bomer for his comments, or would you like us to go to Mr. LaRanger?
Well, let's see if any members of the board have any questions. There's far more detail in this submission on the bike plan, for example. Far more detail, far more information on the parking related stuff. So let me ask if Mr. Mullen or Mr. Gray have any questions for the applicant at this particular point.
No questions right now for me.
No, for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schoen, let me ask Mr. Bomer, and I'll give Mr. Bomer the option. Of Mr. Bomer, if you'd like to go now with your comments, or would you like to have the benefit of hearing Mr. LaRanger's presentation?
That's a good question. I think you can probably tell from my report that most of my issues are about actually looking at some different site options. So, you know, the resolution of the existing plan is maybe of less interest to me than discussing with the applicant some other potential options that I think could help solve a lot of the issues that have come up.
I think, Mr. Bomer, at this point, maybe it might be helpful. It would certainly be helpful to me. It might be helpful to the board, maybe to get your overall. I have read your letter, as I'm sure that other members of the board have. It is on the website, but it probably would be helpful just to hear your summary, your overall comments regarding it at this point.
Okay. Well, I think all of you know that I've worked with this team on a number of projects, not all of them in Milton, in other communities as well. And I found them to be very, really a terrific team, actually, a good design side and very receptive developer. So I hope they take that in the spirit, that's where I'm coming from, is having a good experience of really them opening up their going back a bit and opening up their kind of fundamental logic about how they really started with the basic site layouts. Generally speaking, I think you all know that's where I start, is really looking at the approach to the site, how they laid out the buildings. It often starts with number of units they want to fit, number of parking spaces, and then working with a way to arrange the building or buildings on the site. And for me, it's always been pretty critical to look at that closely before going into building details. Although some of the points, and I am anxious, or I'm very interested in hearing what you have come up with since I wrote this report. And I will divulge that I have spoken with Sean Reardon, and he and I came from different directions, and I think landed in the same place as far as the site approach. And I think I can summarize it as this, and again, I know Attorney Schomer and I know the Embark team knows I'm trying to be helpful. I think what's troubling to me about the proposed site layout, it's really not about the number of units at all. I think this site, and I want to be really clear about this, I think this site can accommodate 20 units. I'm confident of that. I've thought about ways of doing it, and so that's not my issue at all. My issue started with looking at, which is common, existing patterns of development. And we know there are a variety of scales and types of development that are very nearby, but there is a kind of pattern about how the fit, or maybe the maintenance of this scenic road idea is kept up. And there are larger scale buildings. They're usually set well back, and there's significant landscaping that creates foreground and if not screening, at least mitigation of scale through providing foreground with larger buildings in the background. And then there's a lot of single family homes much closer, generally speaking. This building, the proposed front building in this development, it's not the closest thing. It's on the closer side of the single family homes on the road, but it's not totally out of character. And I think the scaling of 2 stories and breaking up the facade is pretty effective in many ways. But I think the issue is that at the end of the day, it's a very aggressive approach to site development. And it's exacerbated by the fact that it's split into 2 buildings. So there's one building that is relatively close to the street and another one that's set back with a tight parking court, which also serves as the entry to the parking that's within the footprint of Building B. It's very tight. That's raised some concerns with me. I think as Jesse's pointed out, with the fire department, as far as certainly with multiple vehicles, and with Sean Reardon as well. So the reason I use the term aggressive site approach is that it's mounted up in the front and it's cut deep in the back. So and it's very close to the property lines, given the depth of the cut. So it's a real total transformation of the site, and with, I think, really limited benefit. And again, I'll go back to saying that I think 20 units could fit on this site. So it makes me question this approach that takes 2 largish, and I really mean largish, one's an 8-unit, one's a 12-unit building, and splits them apart, creating I think a moderately useful courtyard. Even from the residents' perspective, it doesn't create usable outdoor space, and certainly there are concerns about just any emergency access to it. In addition to the notion of pulling this thing apart, that certainly has some impact on the public realm, because it does move the larger, or it's actually the smaller piece closer to the street. It does create technical challenges, and primarily through the having to build a plinth, building in some places some very tall retaining walls. Again, all for the purpose of—
Mr. Bowman, could I just stop you for one moment and
Sure.
just issue a jargon alert? And
Sure. I'm sorry.
and I know that people are listening. I just want take a moment to explain what a plinth is.
Okay. A plinth is an architectural term for a flat platform, and it's usually used, and I won't go back to the historical use of it, but it's a flat platform. And in this case, it's a platform that's created by building up the site close to the street, or closer to the street, and carrying that through as a cut into the hillside towards the east. So in the towards closer to the street, it's this platform is at the level of the first residential floor, and at the rear building, the platform is at the parking level. So it's in essence just making a terrace. It's terracing the site in order to, which I think was clearly the right idea, putting the bigger building in the back, smaller building in the front. That all makes total sense, but it ends up being an intervention of a scale that virtually the entire site, with the exception of the far eastern end of the site, is disrupted. It's a full creation of a new site. And so in any case, just getting back to why that approach to me is not the right approach to take. In addition to the limited benefit of doing it in the first place, technical challenges, added expense to the project because of building two buildings, generally speaking, versus creating one building of the same volume is more expensive, generally speaking, and having to spend a very large percentage of the project budget on site work, especially for so few units, is generally considered to be something to think very hard about. But from a lot of that is just not my realm, in a sense, that it's kind of the developer's notion to decide what's marketable, or look at the market perspective. So where it starts to impact my review the most is that I think that it certainly is outside of the pattern of development. It is a larger development. I think a lot of sincere effort was made to break up the scale of this, even using the front building to serve as as a kind of foreground for the rear building. So there are lots of things that make a lot of sense, but the pattern of development really isn't that way. And I think if kind of preservation of that scenic road, of that kind of public realm is important, I think that I would just look at this. I suggested two different ways. One is to just look at it as what it is. It's a 20-unit building, and what am I going to do, like other larger buildings in the neighborhood have done, to make it fit in, to mitigate the scale, to really preserve that feeling of that road for everybody's benefit, not just for the residents of this building, but clearly all the existing residents. And that, to me, means you need more landscaping on the front. Fundamentally, I think that's really what it comes down to, is bigger buildings generally are pushed further back from the road. And it gives you, I think, some real opportunities, including even preserving existing trees on the site, which I think is always a good place to at least think about starting, is what aspects of this site that people love and familiar with, what can be preserved on this site. Admittedly, this isn't a historic garden like other projects we've looked at together, but it still is, I think, a very nice piece of fabric along the street. So that's one approach, is to just say it's a big building, push it together. Perhaps there's a split in the middle of the building that's where the elevation, the different floor levels are dealt with through the elevator core. I'm not sure, but I think it is possible to make it one singular volume as opposed to multiple volumes, and then use the traditional method for mitigating the scale through having more space in the front of the building. The other method is very different because it is probably the most sensitive to the existing grades. And I mentioned this in my letter as well, which is, especially with only 20 units, consider a different housing type. They're already walk-up units. Half of the units are walk-up. This isn't an elevator-fed proposal. So if you're willing to have half the units not accessible in any case, I think it's worth thinking about a more modular approach, a townhouse kind of approach. Look at a type. My office has done multi-family townhouse types that have single units on the first floor, two-bedroom unit, one-bedroom units on the first floor, two-bedroom units on the second floor, that can actually follow the slope of the site, resulting in much less excavation. There, like every particular type, there are associated issues, but just from my initial look at the site and the grades, it looked to me like that was a realistic possibility. So, not to be overly negative, but that's where I'm at, is that I know this team has the horsepower for looking at a lot of options. They've proven that many times over. And in this case, I think they got off on the wrong foot. Is just, I think, the most honest way I can say it. I think there are better options for site planning that protect the public realm, and I think could potentially even cost the developer fewer dollars to follow through on. There are other things that are more on the level of boilerplate that are brought up in my letter, like bike storage, and I appreciate it. Sounds like you have looked at bike storage in a community like Milton, on a road like that. You need bike storage. So I think that's where I landed. I don't mean to over condense, but for me, it's hard to dive into the detail if I'm having trouble kind of accepting the fundamental premises behind the design, certainly the placement of the buildings.
Thank you, Mr. Ballmer. I have a question, but I'm going to ask before that if Mr. Mullen or Mr. Gray have any questions or comments for Mr. Ballmer.
I don't have questions for Mr. Ballmer. I appreciate that viewpoint. I'm wondering the reaction to Mr. Ballmer's peer review, because what I'm hearing are fundamental changes to the project, and I'm wondering if it's better that we hear from the applicant on that before we get into some of the finer details that are on the table. This just seems fundamental to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I do have a question relative to that, to something like that as well. But Mr. Gray.
I agree with the approach that you and Jeff have just discussed, and I don't have any further questions at this time. I'd like to hear more about from the applicant as well. Thank you.
So, thank you. The one question I have, Mr. Palmer, is that, and this also came up several times during the course of the site visit the other day. Currently, there are several very significant retaining walls. And you alluded to construction close to the sight line, stuff like things like that. Do you have any comments on well, the whole issue of retaining walls in general relative to this project?
Well, I do, and I guess there's well, let me say this, and I mentioned it before, that certainly aggressive site work approaches are justifiable typically, when it's spread over a large number of units. If there's a really good reason to do it, it can be a legitimate approach. In this case, because of the unit count, primarily because of the unit count, it seems maybe not appropriate. When the issue with building with the deep retaining walls here, certainly technically feasible. That's not at all in question. The taller walls that are shown, I think the tallest walls are something like 12. I'm sorry, I don't remember perfectly. 11 or 12 feet, something like that. The tallest walls. I think the concerns I would have in those cases is not whether they can be engineered. They can be engineered. I think it's the, there are trees. There's actually a really nice dense tree line on the south side of the site, close to the property lines. There is no way those walls are going to be constructed without impacting the root ball of those trees on the adjacent properties. I just don't think it's possible. There are ways to mitigate that impact. It involves pre-excavation, root pruning, fertilization. There are plenty of ways to do it, and there may not even be a legal obligation to protect trees on somebody else's property. But I think it kind of goes back maybe to where I started, which is that the approach of making your own site, just remaking it because the building demands it. In the trees, trees on adjacent sites are a pretty good example of where what you're trying to do for your own site could actually impact the neighbor's site as well. The south side is not the site that has the most impact. The most vulnerable structure is that single family home on the north side of the site. And on that side of the site, there really aren't big retaining walls like there are on the south side of the site. But technically, it can certainly be done, but you have to be very sensitive if you really want to preserve what's outside of that wall. At that depth in particular, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Ballmer. And Mr. Schomer, I think I'd like to turn it over to you for a reaction comment. Mr. Mullen raised some interesting points.
He certainly did. We always appreciate Mr. Bomer's feedback on these projects, and this is certainly no exception. We're taking into consideration the issues that he brought up, and we're trying to digest his suggestions that he was just going into a moment ago about potential reorientations of the mass and rethinking the site grading. There's certainly points well taken. And we're going through as a team now with the civil and with architecture to ascertain how feasible some of those ideas are. So at this point, we don't have a fulsome response to those suggestions. We'll take that under advisement, and with a suggestion, I would say that if possible, if Mr. Bomer has availability, we'd appreciate a direct one-on-one working session between the architects to hash out some of the ideas and get into a little bit more detail in terms of what he has in mind and if it's feasible. That all having been said, I do think that there are a number of the issues that Tim from Embark was planning to go through with his discussion tonight that would line up with a lot of the issues I think that Mr. Bomer was raised in his letter and in his comments tonight. And so I think even if the project might be making some revisions based on his remarks, I think there will still be a great deal of overlap, and I think we might be able to address some of the issues and give ourselves a head start as we get into a one-on-one conversation with him and with Mr. Reardon as well. So that's my initial response to it. Tim, did you have anything further?
Well, Mr. Schomer, before we do that, and I'm going to let Tim do just a second. So just so that we're clear, what I basically heard is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what I basically heard was that you're going to take Mr. Bomer's suggestions under consideration, review it as a team. You haven't said categorically no. You haven't said categorically yes. You're keeping your options open, but it looks like the potential for a one-on-one work session with Mr. Bomer at some point in time with a report back to the board may be useful. Is that a fair summary of where you are at this moment?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I think just out of a sense of fairness at this moment, I just would like to give Mr. Galvin an opportunity if he has a question or would like to make a comment at this point, realizing that you'll have sufficient time later on in the hearing, but just as a as a matter of courtesy. Mr. Galvin, anything that you would like to add at this point?
Very, very briefly, I think you've already heard some sentiment from my clients. They're concerned about the density of the project and its proximity to the street. The property that's just to the north, the Burnett property at 924. Mr. Ballmer mentioned its impact. If you're standing on the street in front of this site and then you walk up the street slightly in front of the Burnett property and then you look at the front elevations, you can see the concern that the Burnett property in particular has, because this building, when it sits upon the platform that it's been proposed for, is significantly taller. Even though it's 2.5 stories from the average grade and the finished grade of this project, it's significantly taller and it's very close to the street. As the discussion was going by, I was looking at the town's GIS map, and I think this property will be the closest to the street in the entire neighborhood. On the opposite side, and it is not my client, it's Curry College, there's a property that appears to, there's really no buffering on that side of the site because the buildings are located so close to that site, and it appears to rely on the buffering that exists on the Curry College property to provide some of its buffering. And I think that's just kind of indicative of the fact that it's overly dense and overly large and overly close to the property lines. After the last meeting, I had a number of comments from a number of the people that I represent, and uniformly they were concerned about its proximity to the street and the massing and scale of the building and how it really didn't look like anything in the neighborhood. And I'm really taking the Curry College institutional buildings out because Curry College is an institution and they have classrooms and they have dormitories, and that's not what this is. This is intended to be dwelling space. I think those are my comments at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Galvin. And Tim, just one, any other questions from members of the board? Okay. Mr. Schumer, you can proceed, please. Tim.
Frank, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Comment,
Mr. Mullen.
This issue of, I mean, I let me remind the members of the board the amount of time that these 40B hearings take from everybody. And I really do want to be sensitive to, if there is going to be fundamental changes to the project, I don't want to go over this same issues twice. It gets confusing for people. I'm happy to hear from Tim too, but I would just caution people that I don't want to get too far ahead of where this might be headed in light of the initial comments. That's my only concern.
Understood, Mr. Mullen. I think that's not our intent, I think, to go into the details of this necessarily, but more, I think, to go through the issues that would be common to the project, whether it looks exactly like it does today or it will look something more like what Mr. Bomer is suggesting. And just, if I might add, it's particularly helpful at this stage to have a sense from Mr. Bomer, and this is not to put words in his mouth, but the sense I got is that we're more or less on the right track in terms of density of units. So from this point, it's a matter of designing the site in a way that's appropriate. So I think the issues that Tim will go into have to do with that question. So Tim?
Okay. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I share allow me to share my screen here. Is that plan visible? Can everyone see this? Should be a site plan.
Yes.
So yes, so to reiterate, this is not a response to Mr. Bowman's report, which we're still digesting over the last few days. This is more a clarification and additional details based on the questions that came up at the initial hearing at a site walk. So just to start here, to kind of reorient everyone with the site, there was a significant grade change of about 20 feet from the western edge here at Bushel Road, so where the existing building is at the southeast corner of the site. So our approach really was try to utilize that that grade change to reduce the footprint as much as we could in terms of getting the parking under the building and then screening one building with the other building, as Mr. Bowman had kind of noted. So this is a site section that cuts across. You can see the key here, east to west across the site. That we previously showed. We've layered on a little bit more detail here because I think at the site walk we were trying to, it's a little bit difficult to explain kind of exactly what was going on in relation to the existing grade. So I think this illustrates that quite nicely. So here on the left side of the site is Bushel Road. Property lines are the blue dashes, the front building and the rear building over the parking. And then this red dash here represents the existing grade. So what we did with the grading is place the parking, the front of the parking and the rear of the front building kind of at grade. So everything in front of that is about 3 to 4 feet of fill, which creates that little plinth over that little berm above Bushel Road of a few feet. It kind of creates a nicer separation of elevation there for those the front entry of those units. And it kind of represented here by this kind of teal color. And this is a section that represents the cut and fill line. And then to the rear, everything beyond that gets cut out, so that way we can bury the parking. And then by the time we're back at the rear of the site, the first floor living space of that rear building is equal to adjacent grade again. So then, as you can see here, we also dashed in the existing house and where that exists. The grade of the existing house is 124 feet, and that's compared to 118 feet at the kind of first floor living space of that rear building. So that 6 feet of difference kind of gives us, it really creates half a story. So at the end of the day, by the time we're at the roof of our rear building is at only about 5 feet above the roof of the existing property, just to kind of give people a sense of how that scales. And then these dash lines here represent the view lines standing at the east side of Bushel Road, standing across the street, kind of at the base of the property across the street, and from that second floor of the property across the street. And as you can see for all three, the front building kind of shields that rear building pretty significantly to a degree that you don't see it at all. So that was really the intent going into the site. Those kind of two items in terms of bearing the parking, taking advantage of having that kind of overlaying the footprint of the parking of the building itself, taking up less of the site that way. Hiding that parking court and the entrance to the garage kind of in between the two buildings, and then hiding that rear building. That's just kind of how we approached it. And we're totally willing to look at other approaches and kind of work with in a working session with them. But the other thing that I think this approach did was that we might be able to do with a single building, but we were certainly able to do with the separate buildings, is to create those private entries at every unit, whether it's at grade entry that's accessible or just a single walk up with a private stair. Whereas the grade change is significant enough over the course of the site that one single building, I think, would require more internal circulation, kind of more of a traditional multifamily building, as opposed to this kind of more scaled down approach we're going for. But that's just kind of, I think the site plan kind of illustrated the basic site concept in a way that wasn't totally clear for everyone previous to this. So beyond that, we have some additional information on the bike parking and the landscaping that we can get into. Oh, and sorry, here's the, this was submitted for the record last week as well, but here is just that, the cut fill in plan from our civil engineer. Again, the fill would be in that teal, and the red is the cut. So it corresponds to this section here. So looking at the streetscape a little bit more closely, there's a setback that ranges from about 12 to 20 feet that we berm up to get that few feet of rise from the existing property line to the kind of raised walk area and then planting buffer in front of the buildings. And then there's about an 8.5 foot setback from the property line of the street itself. So that creates a fairly significant buffer that we're adding plants and some larger trees where there aren't any currently. And just, I don't want to get into the landscape too much, but generally speaking, you can see the growth rates here. The planting plans call for these 3 sugar maple trees, where at a 3 to 4 inch diameter at planting would create a 15 to 20 foot height at planting. And then with a growth rate of 6 to 8 inches the first year, 12 inches the second year, and then 12 to 18 inches in the third year and beyond. Within 5 years of planting, that 15 to 20 foot tree would be more like 20 to 25 feet. So within a short order, there'd be a fairly significant screening between that front building and the street. And then in terms of buffering from the neighbor to the north, here's a section cutting across the driveway. So we're looking back towards the rear of the site. Again, we're raised up a bit, that 4 feet here. There's sugar maple trees that wrap the side of the site here, and you can see that in plan between the driveway and the building. And then to the north property line here, we're again a few feet above grade, and then between the retaining wall and the property line is about a 7 foot clearance. And within that space, there'll be a line of evergreen plantings that at planting height would be about 10 feet. And then with a growth rate of 8 to 12 feet the first year, 12 to 18 feet the second year, and then 2 feet beyond that. Within 5 years, we would almost double the height of that to about 18 feet for those evergreens, which provides a nice natural screening and buffer for headlights exiting the parking area. And that's the intention of these without having to screen it with a fence. The only fence screening would be at the end of the driveway here. You can see the trash enclosure for easy access for trucks, but kind of visually reduce the impact of it. And then here's just a few images. Here's an example of what those giant red cedars would look like implanted in a row as a screen. And this is an approach that we can take, as Jesse was kind of noting, that regardless of what of the direction of where the massing and the kind of fundamental approach the buildings take, I think that the screening concepts would remain the same. And then here's a couple examples of the sugar maples, the oak trees that go within the parking area, the existing larger evergreens that exist at the corner of the two sites that would remain, and then some other smaller evergreen plantings. If you go back up a slide, that kind of buffer the entrance drive on both sides of the curb cut to kind of soften it a little bit more. And then the last kind of section and landscape details we have here is at the retaining wall itself. So as noted, it's about a 12-foot wall at the end of the parking. So again, we're cutting through the parking here. So you see the rear building beyond here in section, and here's the property line, and then here's the property to the south. So that property line is about that retaining wall is about 3.5 feet off the property line and about 12 feet tall at its tallest point. But it's actually 2 retaining walls that we terrace. There's a lower 4.5 foot wall, and then that space in between gives us an area to add some low shrubs and some kind of vining vegetation that would cover the wall in order to kind of soften the face of the wall. So in perspective here, this is kind of just a quick little, not really rendering, but a perspective view looking into the parking. So the front building at the front here, rear building to the left. And here's that lower 4-foot retaining wall, and then the larger wall behind that kind of slopes up with the site. That would be covered with it would be like a living wall. There would be a vegetation that grows from the bottom and creeps up the wall as a vine, and then the kind of the closed board fence on top of that. So again, just kind of some images. Virginia creeper would be the plant that's currently specified on the planting plan that grows up a wall like that, and then a more flowering climbing hydrangea. And then here's an example of a kind of closed board cedar fence that would top the wall. In terms of the wall itself, given the size and proximity to the property line, we haven't engineered it yet, but it will most likely be a concrete retaining wall, and which kind of brings up connotations of something very industrial. But there are approaches you can take to it to make it either smooth or add a texture through the formwork and make it a lot more architectural and kind of aesthetically pleasing. There's just some examples of what that could be. We haven't gone into the kind of design details of that yet. And then moving on here, just a little bit more information about the parking that was submitted as well. So just to reiterate, there's 35 total parking spaces. 22 of those are within the garage, and of those 22, 17 are standard spaces and 5 are compact. The standard spaces are 8.5 feet by 19 feet per the Milton zoning, The compact spaces are 7.5 by 18 feet. So the 4 compact spaces, the 5 compact spaces, 4 of them are towards the rear of the garage, and there's a 5th kind of up in the front corner. In the surface lot, we have 13 spaces, and 11 of those are standard size spaces. They're actually a little bit larger. They're 9 by 18. And then 2 van accessible handicap spaces that are per code 8 feet with an 8-foot loading area. In terms of bike storage, we have 20 tenant storage spaces in the garage at the far wall on vertical racks. And I have some images on the next slide on what that would look like for a 1-to-1 unit to space ratio. And then around the parking up front, we have 20 more spaces that are ground mounted on inverted U racks to serve as either more convenient parking, outdoor parking, or visitor parking. So 3 of the racks that hold 2 bikes each are at the base of one stair, 2 more racks at the base of the other stair, and then some along the front as well. So again, here's a couple examples of what those kind of vertical wall mounted racks look like, and then a couple examples of what those the ground mounted ones kind of bolted right in place or right into the ground, not like it wouldn't be like a schoolyard rack that's kind of portable and holds like 10 bikes there, but something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, elegant. And then beyond that, I know there was a discussion about proximity of what's within range of walking and biking and transit and kind of amenities around the site in the last meeting. So we do have a little bit more information on that than was previously provided. So this kind of clover cluster here is looking at it's a proximity map of it's set at 12 minutes. So basically 10 to 15 minute bike range of the site. So the site here is the blue dot. And as you can see from this, Reedville, Fairmount, and Hyde Park stations are all within that range. Mattapan is a little bit outside of it. The high school is just about in range. That just kind of gives you a sense of what's feasible to bike to from the site. We think it's fairly doable. It's actually quite transit oriented in that sense. And then kind of very specifically, previously we were just showing the kind of a similar radius diagram, but doing actual routes for how you can get to each station. Each one's about just under 1.25 miles. So just under an estimate of about under 10 minutes for biking to those, all 3 Reedville, Hyde Park, and Fairmount stations. And then looking a little bit more closely at the site now, walking, again, this is similar, 10 to 15 minute walking cluster. Doesn't quite come to the Stop and Shop on Truman Parkway, but it does capture a couple of playgrounds and fields that are in the area, and also the corner of Atherton and Blue Hill Ave, which is has a bus stop there along 138. There's also a daycare center there as well. And then again, looking kind of more specifically, the Stop and Shop is just under 3/4 mile or 5-minute bike ride, and then the Monahan Playground in Boston, which is accessible via a couple residential streets. You don't really have to cross any major parkways or down any major avenues there. Is a 1/2 mile, so about a 10-minute walk. And then the Flatley Field is on the other end, south down Brush Hill. It's about a little over 1/2 mile or 10-minute walk from there as well. And then on energy efficiency, as I believe was noted in the written response, because Milton is we didn't sign into too much detail here, but because Milton's stretch code, we would be required to meet the HERS rating of 55. And for those who aren't architects on this call, the HERS index is a rating system that's based on a scale of 0, which represents a net zero energy building, and 100 is based on standard current building code. Existing houses would be more in the 130 to 140 range. And the stretch code requires you to have a rating of 55, which means you're 45% more efficient than the kind of a baseline home. And you're more like 80% more efficient than your standard existing home. So ways that we would meet that rating include just ensuring that there's the wall roof assembly have proper insulation, which is also dictated by code as well, and then door window glazing at a certain U factor, using efficient equipment at the HVAC system, the condensers, the air handler units, water heaters, using energy rated appliances, with both the interior with both the interior and exterior lighting, using LED fixtures in the interior, using dimmable switches, properly switched lights. You can have full control of them and kind of keep the lighting level down. On the exterior, having enough lighting level to keep it safe, but not having light pollution or wasting power. And then program thermostats. And then, as was discussed at on the site walk, having a white membrane roof where we have flat roofs in order to keep the heat gain down. So these are the kind of the basic things you can do that aren't really as notable as like a photovoltaic system or like a geothermal system, but they add up to kind of create a much more efficient building. We also looked at the site for its ability to have a PV system, and because of the kind of the mature tree growth to the south of the site, this is not, it's pretty shady. So I don't know if that would be efficient or really a good use of a system. And then last line here is just a figure graph showing the footprints of the building in relation to the nearby developments. So you can see here the dash blue line is the property line with both of our buildings here. Again, kind of north is just oriented straight up. So we are a little bit larger than the single family homes, kind of along Cushing and Brush Hill, but significantly smaller than the kind of more institutional buildings at Curry College. And kind of most comparable, I think, as it would make sense, as kind of multifamily development to the buildings at the Woodmere Drive development, the triplexes and duplexes here. So I think this offers a kind of good reference point. So that is the end of what we have prepared here. I guess we can take I can flip up to some other slides if there's any specific questions, or I can keep this shared.
Well, why don't we pause at this particular point in time, because I do think I gave some latitude here, and some of the stuff may be applicable to other things, but take Mr. Mullins' point. With all due respect to the applicant and the rest of the parties, it kind of sounds like we're at a little bit of an inflection point. If we're going to have a major redesign of this particular thing, and that decision has to be made. I'm with Mr. Mullen and maybe with Mr. Gray. I'm not particularly interested in wasting anybody's time. If this isn't going to be the project that we're going to be discussing, and Mr. Schumer, I have to assume that you and Mr. Galvin are in the same boat too.
I think it's we certainly take that point, Mr. Chair. At this point, as I mentioned, we're considering Mr. Boehmer's comments. I wouldn't say it's a foregone conclusion. The project will be going through a full design revision. So the intent of going through Tim's presentation, and Tim, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and take your screen down. Thank you. The reason why we wanted to go through it is because there were a number of questions from the board members and members of the public, both at the first meeting and at the site walk, regarding the issues here. And there was a fair amount of overlap between the issues in Mr. Boehmer's letter. And so we're trying to demonstrate that we are being responsive to all the issues, including Mr. Boehmer's comments. But since we're just still digesting them, we haven't had a chance to take them on board fully. But so we take
point well taken. I just want to be as efficient with all of our time as possible, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth or predispose or say that we're predisposed or anyone's predisposed to go into any particular direction, but it just seems to me that there's some fundamental decisions that will need to be made over the next couple of weeks. Mr. Mullen, Mr. Gray, anything you'd like to add?
I found Mr. Laranga's presentation very useful in that it showed the walking and biking distances, which I know were an issue at the site visit. So I think that part definitely of the hearing was his presentation was useful, and I also found it useful to get a better sense of some of the perspectives that he showed with the massing and the plantings from different angles. So I think this was time well spent, regardless of whether the project gets redesigned. Beyond that, I don't have any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Mullen?
Thank you. So on that graphic that shows the cut and the fill, thank you for doing that. What is the net on that?
Tim,
Hold on, I can bring it up. Let me bring up the actual drawing. The net is 3,270 cubic yards of cotton.
32, how many, I'm sorry?
3,270 cubic yards of cotton is the net.
So that's coming out. And then if I understand the graphic, if you're walking on Blue Hill Avenue in the traveled road, the elevation will be slightly higher because you're building a berm
Yes,
just past that tree line.
correct. It's about the elevation of the first floor slab of the front building is about 4 feet above the road.
And there'll be no sidewalks. I'm not suggesting there should be, but there aren't any sidewalks.
There are no sidewalks on.
Okay, okay.
There will be a walkway in front of the building that's that circulates the perimeter of the building as access from the parking. Because the front door of 4 of those units are on the front of the building.
Is the treatment that you're providing between the pavement and then the property line and then the improvements, is that designed to accommodate pedestrians in any way?
There's currently no treatment to the area between the property line and the road.
Well, what have you got, grass there?
There's currently grass there, yeah.
So that's what it'll be like. It'll just be to the east. It'll just be slightly higher than it is today.
Correct. It will remain grass, and then the slope would have some low plantings of grass, and then the larger trees kind of lining it.
Okay, thank you. No further questions, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. Mr. Schumer, is there anything that the applicant would like to add at this point?
just to go back to the point that Mr. Mullen was raising regarding sidewalks, I think that's something we'd like to discuss with Mr. Bomer, because one of the comments in his letter was a suggestion that we add a walkway down to Brush Hill Road and a waiting area for buses and Ubers and something of that nature. So I think that's something we'd like to explore with him in terms of whether it does make sense to add sidewalks to the front of the site. I'm not sure it does, and I'm curious what his viewpoint is on that. Obviously, as Tim mentioned a moment ago, there's not currently sidewalks in the area. However, that being said, it's not to say that this project can't try to be a trendsetter and be the first one to establish a sidewalk on this road to make it more pedestrian friendly than it is. So we'll go into that with Mr. Bomer.
All right.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say about that is the fact that it's a scenic highway is going to add some additional issues on that. So, but I'll leave it to the designers for now. Everybody appreciates the issues on Brush Hill Road with respect to those matters.
All right. Any other questions or comments from the moment, at the moment? All right, Mr. Galvin, I'd like to give you another opportunity. If you have anything additional you'd like to add at this point.
I don't think I have anything additional to add at this point. I think we just kind of wait to see what happens with the project.
All right.
Mr. O'Brien, would you mind if I make a small comment?
Please.
Okay. A couple of things, just on the walkway thing, and I think it is probably better discussed in the working session. I think my main point with the walkway was just ensuring that the development met AAB standards for an accessible walkway from the apartments to the public way. So, and currently the that there is no walkway. The pedestrians would share the driveway. So that's why I brought that part up. I think the scenic road, whether or not to extend a sidewalk and be the only one out there, I think is a legitimate question for thinking about, but that isn't what I was suggesting. The other thing I just wanted to join in, add a few comments to the presentation, and I just have to say I think that that presentation to me was extremely thorough, well presented, and I appreciate it helps me really understand where they were coming from in their design, how they landed where they landed, and that's very helpful to me. And not surprisingly, with this team, I think it was really thoroughly done. We still land in a different place, and that's probably the material for because at the end of the day, you still end up with the project that I reacted to and have some contrary opinions about. But I do appreciate the efforts to really be as thoroughly analytical as they have been in expressing how they landed where they landed.
Thank you. So the next scheduled hearing for this, and as people know, we're running on a 3-week cycle with all of the 40Bs. And so one of my roles as chair is to try to schedule our time efficiently, and we will get to public comment in just a minute, but is it reasonable to expect that a work session could be scheduled amongst Mr. Showman, Mr. Bromer, Mr. Showman, to you first, I guess. Is it reasonable to expect that a work session could be scheduled between the applicant and Mr. Bomer in time to have this be to report back to the board at the next scheduled meeting? I'm just, if we're going to go in the same direction, that's one thing. If we're going to go in a different direction, I'm just trying to schedule the time and appropriately and what the next set of issues would be that the board could look at.
Certainly, it would certainly possible. I think scheduling assumed can be arranged, and we'll do our best to work around Cliff's schedule. I think that can be arranged within the next 3 weeks. In terms of whether there's a lot to report back, that may not be the case. In that case, my suggestion would be that perhaps we spend the next session, rather than going to civil, skip over that and go to traffic, because I think what we got from Cliff is that the unit count is more or less on. So the traffic wouldn't necessarily change based on design changes or site changes. Some aspects of it would, I think, in terms of the site accessibility, but in terms of the traffic impact, I think that's not likely to change significantly.
Mr. Gray, Mr. Mullen, any reactions?
I mean, I'm all in favor of trying to make progress where we can and give the developer and Mr. Bomer a chance to work on the design. So I think Mr. Schomer's point about the traffic is well taken. I think that sounds like something we can make progress on 3 weeks from tonight, given that the number of units is, at least might stay the same, might change, but it would be worth talking about the traffic, I think, next time.
Yeah. It was kind of the direction I was leaning in as well, because the normal rhythm of this would be site civil would be next, but if there are substantial changes that could impact the site civil discussion on this, and I think to a certain extent traffic is traffic in some of the issues, but traffic will be an important issue, and appreciate your presentation relative to the biking and walking distances. I know that several of the abutters will. Everyone always has an opinion about traffic, and I'm sure there will be no amount of folks willing to share that, and I would encourage that. Before I turn it over to a conversation or comments from members of the public, let me ask if you guys have anything else that you want to add.
I have one question is, how does the board feel about the civil engineer attending the working session as well? Because if we're talking about moving buildings around on the site, I think it might be good to get some immediate real-time feedback as we discuss those ideas.
I'm all in favor of anyone who needs to be at the meeting, being at the meeting. So I don't think that anyone on the board would have any objections to that.
No, I concur.
And I think my past experience with this applicant is I not to put words in Mr. Schumer's mouth, but putting words in Mr. Schumer's mouth, I'm sure he would agree as well. So
I'm doing my best to nod vigorously to show that, yes.
Terrific. Thank you.
All right. If this, at this point in time, if there's no further comment from some of the parties and stakeholders, let me ask Ms. Sutton, are there any participants, any citizens who have their hands raised and would like to make a statement or ask a question?
We do have one, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name. Stefan Burnett.
Yes, can you hear me? You pronounced it right.
Oh,
Good
We can
evening,
hear
Mr.
you.
Burnett. Welcome to the Board of Appeals. What can we do for you this evening?
So good evening. My name is Stefan Burnett. I live at 924 Brush Hill Road. So I'm the one of the immediate next door neighbor. I was part at the February site visit. During this meeting, today the applicant stated that the site is within easy walking access to public transportation and shopping. During the site visit, the neighbors offered to walk to either the train station or even the Stop and Shop. But the train station is definitely more than a mile away with no sidewalk. And at the time, Mr. O'Brien declined, stating, and I quote, that he did not want to subject the board to the risk of walking there. So that seemed to agree with what we are saying, that this is definitely not, it's not a walkable portion of the street, and which is one of the requirements for a 40B. So can you comment of what you felt this is a dangerous walk?
I think I will decline to comment at this time. I think I'd like to wait until we reach the traffic portion of it. And at that point in time, I think we'll have a full exposition of those issues. But thank you for your comment. And I personally noted it, and I've noted the concerns, and the board has noted the concerns of the neighbors in this area. So thank you for your comment.
We do have another. It is Nolson. I don't know if it's Mr. or Mrs.
Yeah, it's actually, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually Becky Simons. My husband's name is Bjorn Olson, and he has his name in the computer, so that's why. But I just wanted to ask
Ms. Simons, just before you first of all, welcome to the Board of Appeals, and thank you for joining us. What's your address, ma'am?
It's 1053 Brush Hill Road.
Thank you, and welcome to the board.
Thank you. I just had a couple of comments. First of all, with the bikeability of Brush Hill Road, there are, I will say, sometimes bikers on weekends that will kind of come by, in full bike apparel, but like biking to the train station or to the Reedville T station, there's no bike lanes. As we've talked about, there's no sidewalks. It's really kind of a dangerous proposition to be biking on Brushville Road and then further onto Neponset Valley Parkway or wherever you're going. As I said, there's no bike lanes. And I'm not even sure at the Reedville T station, or Reedville commuter rail station, that there is a place to park a bike. I'm not sure. I actually also agree with Mr. Burnett about the walkability as well. I think that the amount of time for walk that you put in on the charts for walking is not quite adequate, is not quite realistic. It's longer than that, than what was mentioned. Let me think. I wrote a bunch of different things down here. Oh, so also with your design in the building, would there be plug-in for electric cars? I didn't hear anybody mention anything about that. So I would, I have that. And I also have concerns about the density. I realized that Mr. Bomer said that, yeah, 20 units would be fine on that lot, but I just think it's so, there's like very little space beside the parking lot and the two buildings that I have problems with the density. And my other final comment that I'm going to make is I do think the buildings need to look more like townhouses. I really liked what Mr. Bomer said, to fit in with the scenic road of Brush Hill Road. A lot of these homes were kind of old estates. There's kind of a mixed, there's some newer areas like Cushing Road is more like 1960s, but you really want to, fit in. You don't want to park buildings in a residential neighborhood, and the buildings really need to look like they belong. And I think a townhouse look would be much preferable. Thank you. That's it for now.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Sutton, is there anybody else?
There's one more, Newman, C. Newman.
Good evening and welcome to the Board of Appeals. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and
Thank you. Yes, I'm Charles Newman. I live at 939 Brush Hill, which is directly across the street from the proposed project.
welcome, Mr. Newman.
Thank you so much. In looking at the first graphic that was put up showing the building, that then the site views across the street on Brush Hill, I noticed that the grade now is 4 feet higher than it currently is. And if you look at the sight lines, people staying on the first floor of the proposed front building would be looking into my second floor bedrooms. And on the second floor of the building, they'd be looking not only in the bedrooms, they'd be looking over my roof. It just seems completely out of proportion to what the graphic was demonstrated. If you were to look at the graphic, you would think my house was a lean-to, when in fact it's a 4,000 foot 1800 built in 1800 classical home that is dwarfed by the first structure, not to say anything about the second structure. So I'm very concerned about it. I hope there is a redesign, but I'm still concerned not only about the density, but also the infringement of the scope of the project onto the neighbors, my abutter, the abutter on the north side, as well as myself directly across the street. So I'm very concerned about that. I just wanted to make my views known.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. We appreciate you sharing your comments and your concerns with us. Is there anybody else, Ms. Sutton?
No, there's
Okay.
no one else.
So I think at this particular point in time, let me ask if either Mr. Gray or Mr. Mullen have anything that they'd like to add, or any questions at this point in time for the applicant or anyone else.
No questions.
No questions. Thank you.
So this is what I propose that we do for our next meeting. So Schomer, Mr. Bomer, I'm going to charge you guys with coming together, putting together, working on scheduling a working session relative to a potential redesign or not, as was discussed during the course of this. Please feel free to reach out. I will volunteer Mr. Sawitsky, since I don't see him here, so I will volunteer him. If you do need the site civil, whatever you need to make this meeting useful. And if you could be prepared to report back in time for us to have a useful discussion of this at the next meeting on March 9th, that would be most appreciated. That means a couple of days before. I think that the other thing is that we will be prepared to discuss the traffic issues on the 9th. And I do expect that there will be, as there already has been at the site visit, and you saw this evening, a number of questions and concerns about that. So we should be in a position to do that on the 9th. So that would be my suggestion. Mr. Mullen, do you have a point you'd like to add? A question? Okay. All right. I thought you did. Just flexing the wrists. Does that sound like a plan, gentlemen?
Yes, it is. We'll make the arrangements with Mr. Bomer and Mr. Reardon and Mr. Zawinski as well. He's typically attended those kind of sessions, so we'll make the arrangements.
Right. With that, if there's nothing further, then I'm going to bring this particular hearing to a close. And so the board stands adjourned until Wednesday, March 9th at 7 p.m. Thanks, everybody, for your time and attendance this evening. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
seeing all of you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.